So our last speaker today, although we will have another session after that, is Jeff Schmidt, who's coming up from the very back. Jeff is our second person today. Oh, are you coming up to? Oh, okay. Jeff is our second person today who's not ICANN staff. Jeff has done a lot of things, technical work with ICANN in the past. Those of you familiar with the collision work and such like that might know Jeff's company. So welcome. You go for it.
Thank you.
There you go.
All right, we got a green light. Green is good. Hey everybody. So I realize that I am, I guess, the second last person standing between all of you and beer. So I'll try not to drone on too much. You know, I guess as a security guy, I'd feel a little bit remiss if I didn't comment briefly on this, the encrypting ransomware that's going around right now, especially since I'm coming off of my third emergency call on it today. You know, it's interesting, right? So the what's it called, WannaCry, it's a realization of, you know, this theory that security people have had for a couple of years now, called the 11-foot ladder theory. The general gist is sophisticated defenders build 10-foot walls, sophisticated attackers build 11-foot ladders. Then sophisticated defenders respond with 15-foot walls, and sophisticated attackers respond with 16-foot ladders, and so on. And so you have that kind of typical, you know, security cat and mouse. However, now you've got a pile of 11-foot ladders laying around that are not particularly useful to the sophisticated attackers. And so what happens to those ladders? Well, they get open source, they get sold, they get passed down. And so this theory is that all of us, non-sophisticated defenders, you know, are subject to increasingly sophisticated attack just because of the way the space is moving. It's been a theory up until yesterday when, you know, we saw what our nation-state tools 2 years ago now used against us in, you know, random hotel or random hospital chains and all sorts of other things. So just an interesting anecdote, current event. So I'm going to talk about this thing we're calling the ordinal data set because everything needs a cute name. There is a clicky. So you make the name first and then you come up with the words for the acronym. So there's the words for the acronym. Real quickly on collisions. The point of this talk isn't to talk about collisions in general. There's lots of stuff out there about collisions. We've written some. Other fine folks have written things about the phenomena of collisions. Again, it's been written about since as earliest we could find was in the early 2000s. There was a lot of interest in relation to ICANN's new GTLD program, and that's when we became involved. The general gist of a collision is, you know, when the resolving party of a query is different than who you think it is. Now, there's all kinds of ways that can happen. It can be accidental, it can be on purpose, it can be because of DNS search path resolution or other sorts of things. But that's the general gist, is when whoever is actually responding to your query is somebody different than you think it is. So things like, you know, squatting and drop catching and confusion at the human level, those are instances of namespace collisions. But we've become more interested in the machine-to-machine stuff, and we found some really interesting machine-to-machine stuff when we were looking at it. That was the Microsoft bugs that we found that you guys probably heard about in our other research. The machine-to-machine stuff, and in particular in the Microsoft domain, is really enabled by extremely complex and extremely aggressive DNS search path processing and DNS devolution. So I like to tell people, you know, the chart that we have about how DNS lookups work, you know, I look up www.cnn.com and I go ask the root and then I go ask com and then I go ask CNN and that sort of thing. It actually doesn't really work like that at all. As Warren Kamari in SAC put it very eloquently a couple of years ago, really it's a structured exploration of the DNS namespace to try to find a name. And your local resolvers try all kinds of things in order to get something to work. And we'll see some examples of that. what I also really want to call out too is this kind of concept of misusing the DNS for authentication. That's the macro issue here that I want to draw attention to. Just because you get a response from the DNS doesn't mean you should believe it. And that's an important thing that I want protocol designers and application designers to think about, because you're looking up myapp.com or whatever, and somebody or something responds. That doesn't mean that you should believe them. You should have some sort of a cryptographic authentication that occurs after that. So let's think about misusing the DNS for authentication. If we think about the legacy protocols, there really was no server-side authentication. And in fact, server-side authentication is really hard. It's a hard problem, particularly when you don't have any sort of pre-existing trust. So think about all the hoops we jump through with things like X509 and how crappy the CA system is, and what a kind of an ugly way that is to create trust where there is no pre-existing trust. And then look at things like SSH, right, where we have to fall into this trap of whether we believe on the first try or do some out of band exchange of trust material. And then most other protocols, particularly older protocols, they just punt. So if you think about protocols like POP and SMTP, there really is no server authentication. So let's talk about SMTP for a second. So SMTP, if I want to send an email to Jeff@company.com, the MX record for company.com gets resolved in the DNS, and then in almost all instances, my mail server believes them and sends the mail happily to whoever gives me back whatever record I get back in the MX for company.com. And that's great, but there's no cryptographic authentication there. Now there can be, you can force TLS authentication, but in practice that's not used. In practice, at best, SMTP over TLS gets used for in-transit, encryption, but not server-side authentication. Then we get into more interesting things. So Microsoft protocols in particular, Active Directory and SMB, they, until recently, did no server-side authentication. This has all kinds of really interesting consequences. So the crux of the issue that we found with the JAS bug, the MS 15, 11, and 14, was that if a client was looking for important things like group policy objects and login scripts and stuff like that, it would eventually do a naked DNS lookup and trust the response, including falling back all the way to things like unencrypted, unauthenticated WebDAV over HTTP. And so if you imagine, sitting in a coffee shop trying to download group policy objects because your machine is a member of an active domain or an Active Directory, you can imagine fairly bad things happening. These sorts of things are easily exploitable. Responder. By the way, everybody know what Responder is? Have you guys used Responder? Okay. So Responder is a really interesting penetration testing tool. Good guys use it, bad guys use it. Go look at it. If you're technically inclined, you will giggle like a schoolgirl when you use a tool like Responder. It's primarily used for lateral movement inside a network. Once you've gained a foothold someplace, and it pretty typically will tear up a network like a blowtorch through butter. It works on this principle that a lot of the SMB stuff is not authenticated. So the bottom two items there are actually queries that we've seen at corp.com. I'll talk about this, the data set here in a second. But we see people querying us for, whack users, whack J. Schmidt, or in this case, Michelle W. The query there for sysvol, the XXX is some company name, and then the GUID after policies is a group policy object that somebody is trying to download from whoever runs corp.com. Distributed file system for Microsoft, same sort of thing. DNS namespaces are mapped onto DFS namespaces. That's an actual WebDAV request that we received. And again, we get zillions of these at corp.com. And then you have WPad. So WPad is a great example of not doing server authentication at all. Not even trying and getting it wrong, but just not doing it. This is a pretty old issue. It's been talked about at DEF CON a couple of times. And then last year, University of Michigan and VeriSign published some findings they had on this as well. But basically, WPad is a very aggressive, WPad is a very aggressive protocol in looking for its configuration file, and eventually it'll query wpad.domain and look for a wpad.dat file. And if you give it one, it will happily process it. And so we have about 150,000 hosts that ask us right now for their WPad configurations if we were to give them one. Obviously, once you can insert a proxy, then you own the user space. You can grab credentials and do all sorts of other things. We're not doing any naming and shaming in this presentation except Microsoft. So that is an actual query that we get. Machines inside Microsoft.com ask corp.com for WPad.dat. Then we get into all sorts of other interesting protocols. I know I'm running low on time, so again, it leverages the fact that HTTP, so a lot of things, particularly Microsoft protocols like SCCM, that's what SMS, Systems Management Server, uses, and then RPC over HTTP, that's what Outlook Anywhere uses. These things leverage custom methods in HTTP, and they largely punt on authentication. They say that they'll use the underlying transport, namely HTTP or HTTPS, for authentication. So what that means is if either A, if it's using basic or none, then you can just jump right in the middle with a DNS request or hijacking. But if you happen to have a name like corp.com, you can get a certificate for corp.com, and we have one. And so the way that you do server-side authentication in HTTPS is by looking up a trusted X509 certificate, which we happen to have. And so once the client trusts the server, then you get all sorts of other things. These are actual queries that we get requesting SMS packages as well as all the Outlook RPC crapola over HTTP. Then you have all the other random applications that people have written over the years that do really ugly things. So sticking, username, password in URIs, that's kind of as old as the hills. But again, if there's nobody doing authentication other than via the DNS lookup, then you get all that wherever whoever controls the DNS. And so there's a couple of examples there. And then there's some evil ones that are just fun. So we've got people asking for change password, ASP, a screensaver.jpg, which should be super interesting to actually respond to that. So what I want people to learn is that after you do a lookup in DNS, don't just trust the response. You have to do some sort of cryptographic authentication after that. You can't necessarily trust the DNS by design to give you who you think you're talking to. So what is this data set? So over the course of our research, and if you read our papers, you saw that we figured out how to find these things, and we bought a number of them on the open market that were colliding. So there's a list of some of the ones that we own. I have some favorites in there. VLAN 01 is super interesting. OAuth proxy is super interesting. Default-vert-site-name.com is super interesting. That's another Microsoft thing. These are things that people use short names in their infrastructures, and then eventually com gets stuck on the end at some point. Usually because a host has a name that ends in com, and so the way that Microsoft Devolution works, it gets stuck on the end. Corp.com is the most interesting. So Corp.com was lent to us by the owner during our research, and he has graciously agreed to lend it to this data collection effort. And so all of these names and more will be in the ordinal data set available to researchers. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that. This is fun. So, Microsoft is one of the biggest offenders of using the corp.com thing. So those are actual queries that we get. I love the Xbox control tower.microsoft.corp.com. That's fun. There's some other things in there that if only we were evil, but we're not. So what's in the data set? A couple of high-level stats. I want to call your attention to, so 182,000 hosts query us over DNS. That's mostly from obviously big recursives, so Google, Comcast, but also there's a lot of private recursives in there as well, like businesses. So you can get a sense there of who's screwed up. If you have, a business's in-house recursive sending queries to this address, then you get an idea of who's misconfigured. There's some scary things in here. So 379,000 IP addresses ask us for WPad configurations. So what's ugly about that? Not only there's 379,000 machines that we could probably man in the middle on the client, but also those are end client IP addresses, right? So the 182,000 are DNS server addresses, but the 379,000 are client web traffic. So these are the local resolvers on those clients asking us. So what that represents is a long-lived target list of people that are probably exploitable. All sorts of other things on here that are interesting. People sending DNS updates. So that's another Active Directory behavior, people trying to update their DNS records. So we get 140,000 of those. This was over the month of July in 2016. We also get 2.5 gigs of email per day sent to various corp.com addresses. Again, this is because SMTP works the way it works, and people that send unqualified addresses or have strange mail server configurations get set up or get sent over there. Yep. So this is the last slide. So we have DNS query logs, email metadata in this data set. The actual email, that's obviously has some privacy implications, so we'll have to be careful about how we deal with that. 80 and 443 stuff, the raw PCAPs. We'll anonymize the source IP addresses where it's possible. V4 and V6 are both in there. Nobody filters V6 correctly, so once we turned on V6, we got a boatload more traffic. Depending on if people have interesting ideas on running experiments, then we'll do that. We want to raise awareness. We want to help people. We want to make the internet a better place. And because it's a sensitive data set, we're making it available through DHS has a program for making sensitive data sets available to researchers. It's called the Impact Program. The DHS vets the researchers, and then we're going to ask for a commitment to publish and generally make the world a better place based on publishing and researching these phenomena. And there's some contact information. And that was light speed, so sorry about that.
Yeah. So actually, could we take questions for this session and roll them into the final wrap-up session, if we could, please? So which starts now? Yeah, we
get to leave. Want me to leave? Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, I think you're going to get questions. I think
Yeah.
So what we wanted to do was open the floor to any follow-up questions anyone had to presentations today that they didn't get to ask, which might include talking to Jeff now, but also we wanted to hear just your feedback for the day. We've told you what we're doing. What's your feedback on what you heard? In particular, I wouldn't mind crowdsourcing our research agenda. So be interested to hear. So this is the point of the day where the arrow of information flow comes the other way, and we're interested to hear what you have to say.
This is Andres Ruiz, seasoning. This is just a comment. I strongly believe you should be promoting TLSA when you are speaking about SMTP over TLS. So it was kind of sad that you ignored that bit.
I appreciate that. I was going lightning fast. There are several things I wish I could have said that I did not, but yes. And Dane, too, by the way.
In looking at the corp.com situation, what do you think would be sort of the correlation between the kind of traffic you're seeing with corp.com and corp?
Yeah, so the question is, how do corp.com and corp relate? So the reason corp.com behaves the way it does is because of the very aggressive way that Microsoft does this thing they call DNS Devolution, the way they take apart queries. And so depending on how your end clients are configured and which patch level of which OS you're at and all of that sort of thing, a query will wind up asked to corp.com right before it's asked to .corp. So in theory, they're highly correlated. And I think it was Interile at the VeriSign study or workshop in London a couple years ago had a talk about correlating or somehow relating corp.com traffic to .corp. I don't know, Jim, if Jim's still here, if you would comment on that, but I believe they're highly correlated because of this underlying behavior.
Greg Chawles, 3UK. Regarding your numbers for WPad, I think it's probably way worse than that because I think those instances that you're seeing are probably the outside NAT addresses of corporate firewalls.
WPad is a terrible, terrible, horrible, horrible thing. And unfortunately, Responder also has a WPad module. So while you're giggling like a schoolgirl running Responder, look at the WPad plugin and look at the SMB relay plugin and then think about corp.com, and it's terrible.
Hi, Dwayne Russell from VeriSign. I agree with you 100% that WPad is a horrible, terrible thing, and it really should be held up as the example of why, if you take something to the IETF, you need to see it all the way through. You know, it was an internet draft, but never made it any farther than that before it got deployed everywhere. And you know, I wonder if we should do an RFC that like undoes WPad sort of formally and say it should die a horrible death. Yes, exactly. Or horrible, terrible, you know, all the adjectives.
Yeah. So it's the problem is that it's on by default in IE. That's the problem. No other browser turned it on by default. But there's a lot of yeah. I mean, yes. So I agree it's a WPad problem. It's also a vendor problem that decided to use it in the way that they did. But yes, anything that we can do to get that shut off, I'm all for.
Hi Jeff, Jim Reed. Yes, we did some work I did some work with Interile on the corps.com datasets. That was a follow-up to the original name collision study that was done around about 2013 or there's about, which again Interile had done by analysing root server traffic. We only did a little bit of work on the corp.com datasets, essentially just to find out what kind of crap was in there. And we didn't really think to try and do kind of analysis at that stage. It was a fairly short-term study that was fairly constrained in terms of both time and budget. So we didn't think to go back and then try to do anything to analyse that and correlate that to what was in the root server PCAPs, the DITL servers that was in the DITL datasets. But it's fascinating to see what you've still found there by going looking at this again. And I wonder, from your point of view, when you're looking at that traffic, how much of that can you ascribe to, let's say, for example, not so much the individual Microsoft client or the client resolver behavior, but potentially the resolving server behavior? Is there an instance of it's all coming essentially from edge devices doing stupid stuff, or is it because of the fact that they're misconfigured stub resolver configurations that cause the resolving servers to generate more queries that end up hitting corp.com rather than hitting .corp if .corp was ever put into the root? Yeah, so most of the queries that we see, we theorize, and we have some data to support this, they're coming from the off-LAN scenarios. So, you know, where your machine is at a coffee shop or at home or wherever, and it's your local stub resolver is, you know, exposed to the internet naked as opposed to being, you know, behind a corporate resolver that's, you know, doing this work for you. So I think most of the problem is in the way the endpoints are configured, not in the way that the recursives are configured. Okay, thanks, Jeff. Yep.
Hi, Jeff. Rubinsky. Your presentation reminded me of one presentation at DEF CON 21 by Robert Stuck called DNS may be hazardous to your health. Yep. It was 4 years ago, so he might want to donate some of his domains to your project, like zipinternal.com or proxyphoenix.com, because he might not be using that anymore, and they are as useful as it was then.
It's funny, a gentleman in this room and I had a beer with him in San Francisco not very long ago. So yeah, if you haven't seen Rob Stuckey's DEF CON 21, 23, it's on YouTube. Yeah, just Google Rob Stuckey, DNS is hazardous to your health, and some of the principles of misusing the DNS for authentication or trusting whatever the DNS sends you are exhibited in his presentation, and he did buy some names that he used in his research. Yeah. So it's interesting because the list of names that we have here, JAS owns some of these. The gentleman that owns Corp.com is donating it. Part of where this whole research R&D data set came from is none of us feel comfortable letting these expire now, right? I mean, we can't drop these. We're all very fortunate that the owner of Corp.com is a good guy because, wow. And so, as other names surface, we'll probably talk to Rob and see if he wants to participate. But as other names surface that we can throw into this data set and make available to researchers, that'd be great.
But my question was that do you think that would be useful for GTLD registries and registrars to have authority to take back domains such as this? Or?
That's above my pay grade.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.